Something just shifted in the Pacific, and most people have no idea it even happened. Japan quietly did something this week that military analysts have been waiting years to see, and if you understand what it actually means, not the headline version, but the real strategic weight of it, you start to realize that China's window for any kind of forced reunification with Taiwan may be closing faster than Beijing ever expected. Here's what you need to understand. China's naval expansion has been one of the most ambitious military buildups in modern history. For over 2 decades, Beijing has been constructing a fleet designed for one purpose: power projection across the Taiwan Strait and into the broader Indo-Pacific. The timeline was always the question. The capability was never really in doubt until now. Because Japan didn't just respond to China's navy, Japan struck at the logic behind it. And that distinction matters enormously because when you disrupt the logic of a military strategy, you don't just slow it down. You force the entire architecture of that plan to be rebuilt from scratch. And that costs time, that costs money, and in geopolitics, time lost is rarely recovered. Let me take you back a little bit, because context is everything here. You cannot understand what Japan just did without first understanding what China has been building, and more importantly, why it has been building it. Because this isn't just a story about ships and missiles and military hardware. This is a story about a civilization that believes its moment has arrived, a civilization that has watched the United States stretch itself thin across 2 decades of failed wars in the Middle East, watched the dollar-based financial system fracture under the weight of its own contradictions, and watched the Western-led global order begin to lose its grip on the narrative it once controlled completely. China looked at all of that, and it made a decision. The decision was simple: the window is opening, and we are going to be ready when it does. So the People's Liberation Army Navy, so the plan, became the centerpiece of that readiness. Think about what China has accomplished in shipbuilding alone over the last 15 years. They launched more warships than most countries have in their entire fleet. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, amphibious assault ships, submarines, all of it built with one strategic vision in mind. The vision of being able to project enough force across a narrow enough body of water for a short enough period of time that the United States and its allies couldn't respond before the facts on the ground or the sea had already changed. In military strategy, this is called a fait accompli. You move fast, you consolidate, and you make the cost of reversal so high that your opponent decides it's not worth the fight. That was China's plan. That has always been China's plan. And the entire planned naval buildup was designed to make that plan executable. Now, the assumption baked into that strategy, the assumption that made it viable, was that Japan would remain essentially a defensive actor. Japan's post-war constitution, Article 9, famously renounces war as a sovereign right and prohibits the maintenance of war potential. For decades, Japan played within those constraints. Its self-defense forces were exactly that: defensive. They didn't project power. They didn't reach beyond their own shores. And China's strategists incorporated that assumption into every calculation they made about Taiwan. Japan would watch, Japan would issue statements, Japan would maybe allow the United States to use its bases, but Japan would not act in any meaningful offensive capacity. That was the assumption, and assumptions in geopolitics are liabilities waiting to be exposed. Because what Japan has now done, and what is being dramatically underreported in Western media, is begin the process of shattering that assumption entirely. Japan has approved and is actively deploying what it calls counter-strike capabilities. Let that phrase sit for a moment. Counter-strike, that is not defensive language. That is not the language of a nation that intends to absorb a blow and hope for the best. That is the language of a nation that has decided it will reach out and hit back hard against anyone who threatens it or its interest in the region. Japan is acquiring long-range cruise missiles. It is significantly increasing its defense budget to 2% of GDP, which represents the largest military expansion Japan has undertaken since World War II. And it is repositioning forces and infrastructure in its southwestern island chain, the Ryukyu Islands, which sit in extraordinarily close proximity to Taiwan. Close enough that military planners on both sides of this equation understand exactly what that repositioning means. What it means is this: any Chinese naval operation moving through the waters between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan now has to account for a Japan that can strike back. Not a Japan that will ask the United States for permission before acting. Not a Japan that will wait for a UN Security Council resolution. A Japan that has pre-positioned assets, has declared the legal and strategic authority to use counter-strike capabilities, and has the missile technology to reach Chinese naval formations and potentially even mainland military installations. That changes every single calculation China has made about the cost of an amphibious assault on Taiwan, every single one. And I want you to understand why this matters so much more than it might appear on the surface. Amphibious operations are among the most complex and vulnerable military undertakings that exist. They require an enormous amount of coordination. Ships have to move, they have to slow down, they have to concentrate in predictable areas to offload troops and equipment. And during that window of concentration and vulnerability, that is exactly when they are most exposed to missile strikes. The Allied landings at Normandy succeeded in part because the Germans were confused about where the actual landing would occur. The moment you know where a naval force is concentrated and you have the missiles to reach it, you have the ability to inflict catastrophic losses. Japan now has both the knowledge and the capability. It knows where any Chinese amphibious force would have to move, and it now has the long-range precision strike weapons to make that movement extraordinarily costly. But let's go even deeper, because there's a layer to this that most analysts are not talking about. This isn't just about the physical capability Japan is acquiring. It's about what this development signals for the entire regional order, and for the countries in the region that have been quietly watching and waiting to see which way the wind was blowing. South Korea is watching this, Australia is watching this, the Philippines, which has been growing increasingly assertive in its own disputes with China in the South China Sea, is watching this. Vietnam is watching this, India is watching this, and what they are all seeing is a Japan that has decided the era of strategic ambiguity is over. Japan is not going to sit on the sidelines and manage its relationship with China through careful diplomatic hedging anymore. Japan has made a choice, and that choice sends a signal that reverberates far beyond the islands of Japan itself. Because here is the thing about power in the geopolitical sense. It is never really about the specific military hardware in isolation. It's about will, it's about the credibility of the signal you send. When a country like Japan, with its history, with its constitutional constraints, with its deep cultural memory of what war costs, when that country looks at the regional situation and says, we are going to acquire counter-strike capability, and we are going to spend 2% of GDP on defense, and we are going to reposition our forces in the southwest. That is an extraordinarily powerful signal. It tells every other country in the region that the balance has shifted, that the assumption of Chinese dominance over the Western Pacific is not as inevitable as Beijing has been projecting, and that if China moves against Taiwan, it will not be facing just the United States Navy across the strait. It will be facing a coalition of nations, some formal, some informal, that have each made their own calculation that a Chinese fait accompli is not in their interest. Now, I want to be fair here, because good analysis requires that we also look at this from Beijing's perspective. Because Beijing is not blind to any of this, Chinese strategic planners are sophisticated. They see what Japan is doing. They understand the implications. And the question becomes, how does China respond to a strategic environment that is becoming less favorable than it was 5 years ago? There are a few possibilities. One is that China accelerates its timeline, tries to move on Taiwan before the regional balancing act against it becomes even more formidable. But acceleration creates its own risks. An unprepared operation, rushed before the logistics and the military capability are fully in place, is more likely to fail, and a failed amphibious assault would be a catastrophic blow to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. Xi Jinping has staked enormous political capital on the narrative that China is rising, that China is strong, that the era of humiliation is over. A failed military operation against Taiwan would shatter that narrative in ways that could threaten the party's hold on power itself. So acceleration is not a risk-free option. The second possibility is that China recalibrates, that it absorbs the new strategic reality, continues its military buildup, works on countermeasures to Japan's growing strike capability, and extends its timeline. This is probably the more rational response, but it comes with its own costs. The longer China waits, the more entrenched Taiwan's de facto independence becomes, the more integrated Taiwan becomes into the global supply chains, particularly in semiconductors, the higher the economic cost of any conflict, and the more time Japan and the broader regional coalition has to further develop and deepen its defensive and offensive capabilities. Waiting is rational, but waiting also means the window may never open again in the way Beijing imagined it would. There is a third possibility that almost nobody in mainstream Western media is willing to seriously discuss, and that is that the entire framing of inevitable Chinese military action against Taiwan has been, at least in part, a projection, a narrative. that China has used the threat of force as a political and diplomatic tool, and that the actual decision to launch a full-scale amphibious assault has always been far more conditional and far more constrained than the most alarmist analysis suggests. I'm not saying China is bluffing entirely, I'm saying that the calculation has always been complex and that it is becoming more complex by the month, and Japan's moves are a significant part of why. Let me bring this back to something more fundamental, because I think there's a broader story embedded in all of this that connects to the larger shifts happening in global power right now. We are living through a transition, a genuine historic transition, in how global power is organized. The unipolar moment, the period after the Cold War when the United States sat at the absolute apex of global military, economic, and cultural power, is over. Not because the United States is collapsing, and it isn't, but because other centers of power have grown. China grew. Russia, despite its difficulties, has demonstrated in Ukraine that it can sustain military operations against enormous Western pressure. The Global South has found a new voice in institutions like BRICS, and through its resistance to Western sanctions frameworks, the world is becoming multipolar. And in a multipolar world, regional powers matter enormously. Japan matters enormously. And what Japan is doing right now is claiming its place in that multipolar world. Not as a passive American ally that simply hosts US bases and writes diplomatic checks, but as an independent strategic actor with its own interests, its own red lines, and its own capability to shape the security environment in East Asia. This is a massive development, and it is a development that China did not fully anticipate when it drew up its grand strategic vision of regional dominance. Because China's vision assumed a Japan that remained inside its post-war constraints, a Japan that remained, in the most essential sense, strategically dependent and strategically cautious. The Japan that is emerging today is neither of those things. Now, what does all of this mean for ordinary Americans? Why should someone sitting in Ohio or Texas or Florida care about Japanese defense policy and Chinese amphibious assault timelines? Here is why. Taiwan produces the majority of the world's most advanced semiconductors. The chips that go into your phone, your car, your laptop, the weapon systems that the US military depends on, a massive proportion of them come from Taiwan. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be an economic catastrophe of a scale that would make the COVID supply chain disruptions look minor. It would send shockwaves through every sector of the American economy. And it would almost certainly draw the United States into a direct military confrontation with China, the most consequential and dangerous military confrontation the world has seen since World War II. So this is not an abstract foreign policy issue. This is a question about whether the global economic system that American prosperity depends on survives intact, or whether it is shattered by a conflict that reshapes the world in ways we cannot fully predict. Japan stepping up, Japan acquiring counter-strike capability, Japan increasing its defense spending, Japan repositioning forces in the Ryukyu reduces that risk, not eliminates it, reduces it, because deterrence works when the cost of aggression exceeds the benefit, and every additional layer of capability and will that the regional coalition adds to the deterrence equation makes the cost calculation for Beijing more sobering. This is how great power conflict is, hopefully, avoided. Not through wishful diplomacy alone, but through the hard, unglamorous work of building genuine deterrence. Japan is doing that work right now, and the world, including the United States, is safer because of it. But I want to leave you with one final thought, because I think it's the most important one. We are in a period of profound uncertainty. The old rules are dissolving. The old institutions are under stress. The old assumptions about who holds power, how it is exercised, and what the consequences of challenging it are all being tested simultaneously. In that environment, the temptation is to look for simple narratives. China bad, America good, or the reverse. But the reality is far more complex and far more interesting than any simple narrative can capture. What Japan is doing is not simply about being a loyal American ally, it is about Japan's own survival calculus, Japan's own reading of a regional environment that has become genuinely dangerous. And understanding that nations act from their own interests, their own fears, their own historical memories, is the beginning of actually understanding how the world works, not how we wish it worked. How it actually works. And right now, the world is working in ways that have put China's invasion timeline in serious jeopardy. That is not a small thing, that is a historic shift, and it deserves far more attention than it is getting.